All right, so we are in week 2 of our Towards Strength study. We're walking through these practices of the early church that we read about in Acts 2:42, right? They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, to prayer. And last week we talked about one that's not too surprising, right? The apostles' teaching, the Bible. Like this makes sense. I think this one, though, is pretty surprising for us because immediately Luke goes from the apostles' teaching to the fellowship. And I don't know about the churches you guys grew up in, but in the church I grew up in, I think fellowship was seen as optional, right? Like when we had a Super Bowl party as a church, we had to be like, well, we have to have a devotion during halftime so that Jesus can redeem this, right? We didn't see like hanging out and fellowship as something that was important. But I think it's just so interesting that Luke is like, no, this was something they were devoted to. This was something that was important to them. Yeah. So when you guys think of fellowship, like Sarah, what is it that you think of when you hear the word fellowship?
Well, as a girl who grew up in a little Southern Baptist church.
Oh, we know where this is going.
Yeah. What does every Southern Baptist church have but a fellowship hall? And, I grew up where we had potlucks a lot. And that fellowship hall was used almost every Sunday, honestly, after church. And so it kind of became ingrained in us that this was normal. This is a good rhythm of our church family and our individual family of, my dad was a pastor, but I think that even if he wasn't a pastor, like it would be something that our family did was the fellowship with other believers. And there's something really sweet about sharing a meal together in that place and lingering after church and having so many conversations in that fellowship hall. And I miss that sometimes, because again, when we're talking about this individualistic culture that we live in, how many times do we run out of the sanctuary? It's like, oh, I don't want to sit in traffic. I want to get to the restaurant. And it's like, man, that's so different than what it looks like and what we see in Acts. And even, 20, 30 years ago when I was growing up, it's so different because I think we really miss that piece a lot now. And I wish that we could get back to that, like that really communal being with other people, sharing a meal together, just talking about life. Like it was meant to be lived together and not just in a church setting. It really is a way of life. And, I want to get back to like those potlucks and stuff. Like, can you imagine if we had a potluck with like 10,000 people in our sanctuary? That'd be amazing.
There's too many dishes. Yeah. I do love the idea of a fellowship hall though, because somewhere along the line, someone was like, we have got to contain the fellowship. It gets its one room.
I love it.
Yeah. Derek, anything you think of when you think of fellowship?
I think the first thing comes to mind for me is that like for my family and I, we went to church so many different places growing up and just trying to find the right place. And one of the things that I was always so afraid of was this, like this specifically. Like my parents would let me come to big church with them, but I never wanted to go to Sunday school or youth group or anything like that. And for me, the fear then was like, I don't want to be this outsider coming in that makes me feel a little weird. But at the same time, I felt like, man, I don't know enough, right, about the Bible, and I don't want to look silly or stupid. Like if I don't know something, and it wasn't until college where like I finally got involved in community, like, and it changed my life, and so that's one of the first things that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, so with the transforming power of fellowship, then why do you think we undervalue it? Then why is it something that we don't prioritize it on the level that the early church does?
Yeah, I think for me, I had read a lot of Christian books growing up and even in high school and the first part of college, and I think there's a lot of resources that we have that I'm grateful for, like the YouVersion app and the internet and stuff like that, and sermons we can watch on YouTube. And so I did that for a long time. But something different happens whenever you are walking with other people that are also on the same journey, right? You are going to intrinsically learn and actually learn how to deal with suffering, right? How do you deal with hard things? How do you deal with good times? There's going to be ways that I hear you talking about something or you talking about something that's like, man, I never considered processing this current situation like the way Sarah just did or Brooklyn just did. Yeah. And what God has done through all of those relationships, through that and the combination of God's word has changed me. And so I think that's why we're also passionate about even working at a church and being in ministry, is that we want other people to experience that.
Yeah. That's good.
I think in some ways fellowship is hard for us to gain a hold of because we are so much in a culture of like production and wanting to do things, and I got to learn something, or we have to have value to this, and we don't recognize, like you're saying, the value of just being together,
sure.
like conversations and what we learn, not maybe facts or whatever, but what we learn about people and what we learn about life through the experiences of other disciples of Jesus. So. The word in Greek that's used for fellowship is the word koinonia, which, some Sunday school classes out there are like, well, we know that. That's our Sunday school class name.
Maybe in fellowship hall.
Maybe the koinonia fellowship hall. But it's an interesting word, not just because it shows up a lot in the New Testament, but because it's only used once in the Old Testament. Like fellowship is not only like a patently biblical idea, it's patently New Testament. It only shows up once in the Old Testament. It's in Leviticus 6. And what I think is interesting about that use of the word fellowship is that biblically, the word fellowship is used to describe our duties to our neighbors. Like if we're going to live in community with other people, if we are going to be part of a neighborhood, these are the things we owe to the people around us. This is our allegiance to them. So as you guys think about that, as you think about, casting fellowship in that way, that this is what I owe to the community of faith in my own presence, in my own giving, like what strikes you about that? How does that kind of contrast with our culture of this is what I get out of church versus what I give?
Yeah, I mean, I just think of how many times people leave a church because it's not giving them what they want, or it's not exactly what they want, and it really needs to flip from what can this church do for me of what can I do for my church? Like, how can I be a part of this body of believers? Like, what things has God uniquely gifted me with to serve? Because we've all been given spiritual gifts by him. And so it is our duty to use those gifts for his kingdom and his church family. And I just think of this story I actually heard yesterday. There's an 80-year-old lady who decided to start volunteering in our Next Step room at our Blankenbaker campus. And, she's 80 years old. She doesn't necessarily have to volunteer, but she decided, okay, I have gifts for the kingdom that I'm still going to use. And so there was a girl that she got to meet with who either hasn't been in church in a while or has never been in church. Can't exactly remember, but both of her parents have cancer. And so it was unique because this 80-year-old lady, she's actually a widow who lost her husband to cancer a couple of years ago. And so only the Lord could have done that, of, okay, there's this 80-year-old lady, I still want to use my gifts. And then the Lord brings her into a really unique situation. And so I think there is always a purpose for the gifts that God has given us and the ways that we can serve and like really live out this fellowship aspect, even within our local church, but ultimately throughout our lives. Like there's always situations that God's going to put us in to point others to him and use it for his kingdom. And I just think if we stay, self-focused, we're going to miss out on that. We're going to miss out on that communal aspect. And then I think of God himself, right? Like he is a communal God. And it's kind of crazy to me to think like before creation even existed, God existed in fellowship with himself because he is the Trinity, right? He's 3 in 1. It kind of blows my mind if I think about it. But if we're created in his image, then we are created for community and fellowship with other people too.
So Derek, how about you? When you think about what we owe the community, how we should approach doing church life together, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I think one of the things Sarah said at the beginning, I think is so true, is that whether we believe this about ourselves or not, that if you are a child of God, that you have been you've been so created in such a way that God has given you gifts and abilities that are there to help build his church, right? Not necessarily to help build ourselves up or to impress other people.
Right.
Like those gifts, those things that he's given each and every one of us, if you are a child of God, as he's brought us from death to life as we're new creations in him, they're to build up the church, right? And what we don't want to do is that we don't want to discount ourselves and say, oh, well, the church can't really use me. No, we really can't. Like, we really can, and we need you. Because for so much of my life, I convinced myself that, like, man, because I don't know all this stuff and because I'm not smart enough or maybe not spiritual enough, they can't use me, right? And it's funny because that all I've seen since is God continue putting me in places where it's like, no, like just trust me, I'm going to use you. Like, just trust me. And what I would say is that that's not exclusively true to me.
Right.
That is true for all of us,
Yeah.
which is encouraging because he doesn't just bring us from death to life and leave us. He invites us to be a part of building his kingdom.
Yeah.
You know, if you go through the book of Acts, you'll see their fellowship throughout its pages, right? You get that passage we read last week in Acts 2 about how they're selling things. They have everything in common. In Acts chapter 4, there's another paragraph that talks about just how close-knit they are, how they're gathering every day. And, you know, if you go in even into the rest of the New Testament, you see the fellowship described in some pretty interesting ways. Like Jude, verse 3. There's only one chapter. Jude 3 talks about the fellowship of salvation, that we have this fellowship, this shared salvation that we have. In Philippians 3:10, Paul talks about the fellowship of suffering. You know, that our fellowship is not just about hanging out together. It's not just about spending time together. It's about actually going through the nitty-gritty, difficult things of life. And so, Derek, you hinted at this a little bit, but when you think about how we share those things, how we share the difficulties of life, how does that fellowship help us to grow?
Yeah, I think there's a part in Scripture where Jesus is talking about that we should be bearing one another's burdens, right? And it's hard to do that if you're not walking with other people.
Yeah.
Like it's hard to serve others and love others if you're not surrounded by other people. I was reading this book lately on the early church, and they were talking about this monastic group of people, these monks that were leaving, I think Rome and maybe some other cities, to go out to the desert and kind of focus on prayer and scripture and following God. And one of the things that they kept realizing is that, like, okay, hey, like, are we really able to serve the church and do the things we're supposed to do if we're so secluded from other people and meeting the needs of the poor and the widow and the orphan? And so you even see all the way, centuries ago, the church wrestling with that.
Yeah.
And so I think for us, it's trying to remind ourselves that, like, hey, like, there are other brothers and sisters that may be like you, may be different than you are, that are going to need you to help walk them through life. And we need that from other people. Like, we got to stop being afraid of asking for help from our brothers and sisters. Like, there's this idea of dependence that God calls us to, and especially when it comes to bearing one another's burdens. Like, we don't need to be afraid to share prayer requests. We don't need to be afraid to share when we're hurting, because there are people within the church that want to be able to walk with us. But if we don't open up, they can't do that. And so that's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, talking about the fellowship of suffering and like bearing one another's burdens, the first thing I've kind of thought of was Job and his friends in Job chapter 2. And so at this point in his life, like, Job's lost everything he has.
Right.
And before his friends open their mouths and kind of derail the conversation,
They did
a little
really
bit,
good there for a little.
right, before they opened their mouths, they actually did something really profound, which I love this verse. It seems kind of strange to love it, but I think it's such a beautiful example of this in practice. And so it's in Job 2:12 through 13. And it says, when his friends saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. And I think there's something so beautiful about just sitting with people in the mess and just being there with them. Because I know for me personally, I like to kind of jump over the hard part of like, oh, like, God's good, it's gonna be fine. But sometimes we just need to sit with people in the suffering and sit with them in the sadness and be like, okay, I'm here for you. And we don't do that because we don't like to be messy. Like, we don't like our vulnerabilities to be out in the open. But this fellowship concept, that is the entire point.
Yeah.
Like, if we have to be there for each other and we have to share in our brokenness, because we're all broken. Some of us are better at hiding it than others, But if we are really going to embrace and bear one another's burdens, we have to be willing to be vulnerable, show our mess, and that way we're all in this together and we can support one another better. And so I just think that's such a good example of, like, for me personally, okay, Sarah, shut up sometimes and just sit with people and just be there in the mess with them.
That's good. As we wrap up, I can't help but think about how deep this fellowship went in the early church. There's kind of a throwaway line in Acts 11:26 where it says it was at Antioch that the believers were first called Christians. And one of the theories as to why they begin to be called Christians, why we begin to bear that name, is because Antioch is really the first multi-ethnic church, right? Like, up until this point, it's been largely Jewish-based, but now you have Jews and Gentiles kind of mixing together. And the reason some people think we're called Christians is because there was no ethnic category for people to understand the early church, that they loved each other so well. They were so united by their fellowship that there had to be a different word to describe them. They had to come up with another category because there was no other category. And I think that needs to be true of us, that when people see us, they should see that we're Christians, that we defy all other barriers, all other divisions, because we are truly one in how we fellowship.
Yeah.